So let's begin our discussion of Romanticism, an influential and important artistic and literary movement that occurred approximately from 1800 to 1850. Romanticism in part was a response to the Industrial Revolution, which began in England and then spread to other countries. And you see that in poems like William Blake's London with the chimney sweepers, these harsh living conditions with the factories, uh, etc. And one of the responses of Romanticism is to emphasize nature as opposed to the machinery, that sort of industrialized technology. Now, in the previous era, the Age of Reason or the Enlightenment, you had the questioning of divine right, that the king has this power from God to rule, with the use of logic, scientific reasoning, questioning, those kinds of things. And this questioning eventually translates into revolt, revolution. And we have several revolutions around the world during this time, beginning with the U.S. Revolution and then on to the French Revolution. And unfortunately, with the French Revolution, you had the dark side of this kind of revolt, of this emphasis of the individual in groups versus these established hierarchies with government systems. And in the so you had the Reign of Terror, where you had kind of a centralized dictatorship, and you had mass executions of people with the guillotine. So it was this very chaotic and terrible time. And the Romantic poets responded in different ways to that. Um, and this eventually leads up to the rise of a new dictator, Napoleon. So you had Napoleon coming onto the scene, creating this new dictatorship in France, and importantly, he crowned himself emperor in 1804. And this is really showing that divine right and this idea of a hereditary monarchy ordained by God is gone. And Napoleon becomes a very influential figure to the Romantic poets and artists. He's also very similar in some ways to Satan in John Milton's earlier work, Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost had a great effect on several of the Romantic poets, and that theme of Satan as a rebel. And in Paradise Lost, even though he is the bad guy, of course, he has these eloquent speeches. He takes power. He doesn't give up. He has these kind of noble sentiments in some ways. So interesting kind of parallel with historical Napoleon and then the literary significance of the Satan-like individual figure. So to emphasize again, Romanticism is this artistic, literary, and intellectual movement that began in the late 18th century, and it emphasized strong, authentic emotions and experiences such as horror, terror, and awe. And it was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution. Basically, people were leaving nature in the countryside and moving into the cities, and all the things that we kind of associate in a bad way with cities, with all the filth, the technology, the factories, etc. And so now we're getting this sort of imaginative movement back to the nostalgic good old days where people are closer to nature. Romantic artists like to embrace the exotic and the unfamiliar, going back to medieval times to these kind of ruins that you see in Gothic fiction or in the works of Edgar Allan Poe. Romanticism also emphasized the role of the imagination and the importance of the individual artist in the act of creation, which we still have today when you, for example, Kanye West, he's as good as Shakespeare, so he says. And then you also have the Byronic hero, based on Lord Byron's kind of ideas, which is this stereotype now you see in movies all the time, this gifted, misunderstood loner who doesn't follow the rules of society, who's kind of isolated or an outcast in some way. Think of Edward, for example, in the Twilight movies. So not only do you have political revolutions that are really kind of furthering the questioning of the age of reason and the Enlightenment era, but you also have a literary revolution. And this is really kind of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll era in literature that really still carries over into today. We still have those strains in our pop culture. Gothic is still very popular in movies in different ways. With the Enlightenment, you had the emphasis on logic, form, structure, more of this kind of artificial style, the emphasis on society. They did not really talk too much about kids or children. They were seen as more as adults, as earlier adults basically. And you kind of had this scientific rationalization of natural phenomena. The Romantics went the opposite direction. Again, they're rebelling, against everything. They emphasize the emotions, the passions, nature, the good, the awe, the awesome, but also the awful, the horror, the terror that nature can inspire. These large, vast scenes in nature and horror movies. They also emphasize the imagination, the individual, the rebel, and the outcast. So in Romanticism, we see things like the apocalypse and revolution. They romanticize the past, especially the medieval and Greek eras. Nature, rural life, children versus society and the adult. They again like the hermit, the exile. Um, they emphasize the natural and the supernatural. So you had this with Wordsworth and Coleridge and their lyrical ballads in 1798. Again, emphasis on the exoticism of the East and other cultures, individualism versus set rules that we saw in the Age of Reason. Really important is organic spontaneity, the idea that poetry, according to Wordsworth, should be the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. And we have the same idea in rap music today, where the great rap artist is one who has that natural flow. Don't you know? The emphasis on the sublime, this kind of mysterious, godlike aspect, the intensity of emotions, the intensity of internal and subjective experiences, and the common person. Wordsworth wanted to write as a man speaking to men. And a common form of poetry in this time is the lyric poem, and that's also very similar to what we have with music today in our pop songs. There were six major British Romantic poets that sort of define this era. And the first is William Blake, who was sort of a precursor of the Romantic movement. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Coleridge and Wordsworth were good friends. And I'm going left to right, top to bottom. Then we have Lord Byron, who was quite the character. Percy Shelley and John Keats. And kind of a tragic aspect, like some of the rock stars in our current era, some of these poets died at a very young age, in particular John Keats and Percy Shelley. So William Blake was sort of the precursor to the Romantic poets in England, and he was an engraver. He also did artwork. He had visions, a very spiritual kind of person, and he really created his own mythology in his poetry. If you've enjoyed the Hannibal Lecter movies and the works of Thomas Harris, you're familiar with Blake because Red Dragon, the novel and movie, is based on one of his paintings, and a very disturbing one at that. And while the tiger is also a very disturbing piece of literature, a very powerful poem, the artwork that Blake did for the poem is very different in tone. That's a rather cute tiger there. And it's interesting to see that kind of contrast in his work, just like the tiger is sort of a mirrored parallel to his poem The Lamb. And Blake did actually illustrate his poems. You notice how the text and the artwork goes together, which critics are analyzing more and more. And Samuel Taylor Coleridge had a very tragic life. Due to health issues, he was treated with opium. He became addicted to it like many people did in this time period. They didn't really understand the effects of opium. And his famous work, Kubla Khan, is based on an opium trip, according to Coleridge, which is still debated by critics. Coleridge was very close friends with William Wordsworth and Dorothy Wordsworth, and they took long walks in the countryside. Dorothy Wordsworth's journals are very interesting, in fact. And they had a very interesting relationship. A very key seminal work in the British Romantic movement is Lyrical Ballads in 1798. And the basic plan that Coleridge and Wordsworth had was Wordsworth would take the nature aspect and Coleridge would take the supernatural aspect. Coleridge's focus on supernatural poetry is what leads to the creation of one of the great poems in British literature, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Lord Byron was kind of a male Kim Kardashian, if you want to kind of go there. That's being a little bit too harsh on Lord Byron, but he was really more of the ladies' man, more known for his social aspects in some ways than his literary. But his literary work is very entertaining. Um, the famous quote about Lord Byron is he was mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Women were swooning in his presence. He was kind of the Brad Pitt bad boy of the Romantic era, so he really had that kind of celebrity aspect. And you can see there from the portrait that he was quite the character. He had his own unique kind of style and attitude. Along with Byron and the second generation of Romantic poets in England, you have Percy Shelley, who died very young in a tragic boating accident. He was an atheist. He was one of the first people in England to advocate vegetarianism, and he was not really recognized during his lifetime. Um, Interestingly, his wife, Mary Shelley, wrote the classic novel Frankenstein, and she did that when she was only 19 years old, which is just amazing. And then the final of the Romantic poets is John Keats, who died extremely young from tuberculosis. He's very famous for his just beautifully sensuous imagery of nature and art, and his most famous poem probably is Ode on a Grecian Urn.